Hello, everyone, and welcome to Learning and Mending Tending the Commons. I'm Jen, and as everybody starts to come into this collective space, I'm going to share with you first our embroidery of the week. And I just want to say that everyone is steadily sending them back in, and I now have a queue lined up ready for the next several weeks, and I'm so excited to share with you um, tonight's. This one is Caroline's. And what I wanted to share with you. Oh, wait. I guess my background is on. Oh, I'm so sorry. Didn't realize that. You won't be able to see it. Here we go. What I wanted to share with you was that Caroline has done a felting technique and embroidery. So she's taken wool and felted it into the fabric and then
Whoa,
chose to do the lettering in an embroidery. So I just
beautiful.
wanted to share this because
Next level.
it's beautiful, and I thought it might inspire others to do other things. I know we've had other people. Maria's on tonight, and Maria has added beads to her embroideries in the past, which is also a really cool technique as well. So this is Caroline's hermit thrush and yerba santa. And so what I'll do right now is we'll just do a quick introduction. Again, I'm Jen. I use she, her pronouns, and I am calling in from Studio City. And tonight I will be working on my yellow rumped warbler, which I have made some real progress on the bird body. I've decided to go with just an all beige right now. And then I'll highlight some more colors over it. And I will then pass it on to, let's see, I'll pass it to Cindy.
Hi, I'm Cindy. I'm calling in from West Covina, and I have a crow that I'm going to be working on, but I have to grab it once we get started. I'll go grab it and work on that. And I will pass it on to Maria.
Hi, I'm Maria. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm not really working on it.
Maria, you muted somehow.
I, hi, I'm Maria. I use she, her pronouns, and I live in LA, and I am just going to listen tonight, not doing anything. Maybe I will later, but who knows? And I'll pass it on to Kavi.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Kavilal calling in from Sacramento. I use he, him pronouns, and I'll be reading or sharing the screen for the readings tonight. Yeah, happy to be here. I'll pass it over to Shawnee.
Hello, my name's Shawnee. I'm calling in from Brooklyn. This is my first time, so I don't have anything prepared as far as an embroidery, but I'm here to listen and be present, and I'm happy to see what's about to happen. And
Welcome.
thank you. I will pass it on to Emily.
Thank you. Hi, Emily here, calling in from Highland Park, neighborhood of Los Angeles. She, her pronouns. I've got my lobster friend in the background here, which is a reference to our reading tonight and the sound piece that I'll be sharing to close out the session that we have here tonight. About the last 10 minutes of each session, I share a sound work reflecting on the reading, so I'm excited to share that. And what did I want to say? I wanted to say that I'm thankful so much for this very gentle, supportive, grounding group and conversation that we do every week. So thanks for having me, and let me pass it on to my friend Izzy, who is a key organizer of the selections of readings throughout the series.
Hi, everyone. My name's Izzy. My pronouns are they, she. I'm calling in from New York tonight, and I will be not embroidering, but I will be, yeah, I'll be participating and maybe doodling, and I will pass it on to Jackie, if you're there, Jackie. If not, I'll pass it on to Cecile. Oh,
I will unmute. Hi, Izzy. Hi, everybody. This is my first night, and I'm happy to join. And I actually have been doing embroidery lately. This is made on a pillowcase, and it's using citrus fruit. And then I like shells a lot, so I'm kind of bringing in different elements of the natural world together. And I'm interested in hearing about the readings, which I did take a look at, and finding out what's going on. So nice to see everybody. Thank you. I'm passing it on to Vicky.
Hi, I'm Vicky. I'm calling in from Santa Monica, and I use she, her pronouns. And I'm going to be going to an event tonight shortly, so I don't have my embroidery out, but I've been working on something that someone, a friend of mine from work, gave to me. And with that, I'll pass it to Olan.
Hello, I'm Olan. I'm using she, her pronouns. I'm calling in from my kitchen in Los Angeles. I have completed the embroidery of 1,000,000 stitches, and I have a brand new fresh thing to start with. What is that called, the one that you gave me, Jen? What will I be?
That was the mycelium carbon network exchange.
All right, so currently working on the mycelium carbon network exchange.
Olan, we want to see your finish. We want to see your finished piece.
I just tossed it into the to Jen. I tossed it to Jen. Yeah, I just hope it makes embroidery of the week sometime.
I think it might. Good chance.
And I'll pass it on to Stefano.
Hey guys, how you doing? This is Stefano from LA, the moon, and yeah, always very happy to participate and hear and learn, and not mending, but one day I'll be mending, but for now I'm just listening. So I'm gonna pass it on to Lauren.
Thanks, Stefano. It's Lauren, she, they pronouns, calling in from Metabolic Studio. I am working on one I put down for a while. It's the Lupin.
Beautiful.
And have we heard from Patricia?
No, you haven't for a while. I've been MIA. Patricia Watts, she, her pronouns, coming from Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I haven't touched it in like a month. So I'm just starting. I don't know what bird it is though. Is it on here? The thrush. Hermit thrush in Yerba Santa. And I'll pass it off to Linda. I saw Linda.
Yeah, it was Patricia who turned me on to this wonderful series. I've been enjoying it so much. So I go by she, her pronouns. I'm calling in from Los Altos in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I'm slowly making my way through my mycelium carbon network exchange. So each week, a little bit more gets done. And I will pass this on to Cecile because I think she didn't get to go.
If you want, I can bring up like a couple of plant lights now.
I'm Cecile. I've been missing in the last few weeks because lots of work and stuff. I'm calling in from San Juan, Puerto Rico. So it's a 4-hour difference. It's quite late here, but I'm really happy to join in. My embroidery is a little bit at the beginning stages, but I'm hoping to continue to work on it. And I'm looking forward to the opportunity to listening in tonight. Thank you so much. And I have no idea because I joined in a little bit late. Who's missing? So has everybody already said hello?
I don't think so.
So if somebody might help me out here, who to pass it on to, I'll really appreciate it. Thank you.
I'll say hi. I'm Laura. I'm down here in Kumeyaay territory, just listening in tonight. So good to see you all and hear you all and see your beautiful faces again. And I'm working on helping my mom pack her apartment, so I won't be venting tonight, but I'll be listening into this rich community conversation that I love. Thank you.
And I'll take it from this point. If you haven't had a chance to introduce yourself, there will be plenty of time later this evening. Welcome to the 6th week in this series. In this series, Tending the Commons, we will be exploring how the commons can be an alternative approach to the destructive nature of capitalism, where individual and short-term gains have been prioritized over the common and long-term good. We'll be asking questions like, what are the commons and what does it look like? How do social relations shift within the commons? In what ways do the commons resist the simulated scarcity of capitalism? This is the 6th iteration of Learning and Mending, following a syllabi on abolitionist writing, indigenous perspectives of land stewardship, suffocation, Anna Tsing's The Mushroom at the End of the World, and systems thinking. In many ways, this series is a continuation of what preceded it. We've examined alternatives to capitalism and its destructive, corrosive nature in the previous syllabi. But in this series, we are specifically looking at the alternative to capitalism that is commons. Many of you have received embroidery kits from us of native plants, birds, and microscopic organisms that Metabolic Studio is currently cultivating on its project sites. Taken as a collection, all the embroideries will collectively illustrate biogeoconosis, which describes the intimate association between the living things and the physical environment. If you've not received an embroidery kit, or you would like to receive another one, please send your name and mailing address to info@metabolicstudio.org, and Cindy will drop that information in the chat bar so you can sign up. Tonight, we will share our screen, and we encourage you to read a section of the text aloud with us. When there is a pause in the reading, please feel free to unmute yourself and begin where the last person left off. Silence is golden, and there's no pressure to fill the transitional spaces while we enjoy a breath and continue crafting. Feel free to jump in and continue reading at your comfort level. You don't have to read, it's also fine to enjoy listening. And now I will pass it over to Izzy and she will continue on.
Thank you, Jen. So before we get started with the reading, we're just going to do some guided meditation. So I ask that you find a comfortable position, close your eyes. Coming into stillness and feeling the simplicity of your breath, please take a nice, full, deep in-breath. Now extending the in-breath, filling the chest and lungs, and slow out-breath. Feeling the sensations of releasing the breath, relaxing outward, letting go. And again, breathing in, filling the chest and the lungs, slow out breath, releasing, letting go. One more time, inhaling deeply, filling the chest and the lungs. A slow out breath, relaxing outward, letting go and allowing the breath now to resume in its natural rhythm. Relaxing with the inflow, with the outflow, beginning to gently scan down the body, relaxing the brow, letting it be smooth. Softening the eyes, letting the jaw unhinge, relaxing the tongue down to the root. Let the shoulders fall away from the neck. Sensing a dissolving sensation. Let the hands rest in an easy and effortless way, softening them, letting the chest be open, heart relaxed. Let the next breath be received in a softened belly. This breath, now this one. Relaxing deep in the torso. Sensing in a relaxed and gentle way the movement of the breath. Resting in an awake and relaxed presence. Take one more deep in-breath. Exhale. If your eyes are closed, bring them back open. Return to center. So before we get started on the reading tonight, I'm just going to give a little intro of the text and the author. Silvia Federici is an Italian-American scholar and teacher, an activist from the radical, autonomous, feminist, Marxist, anarchist tradition. She's a professor at Hofstra University in New York, where she's a social science professor. I first became familiar with her work my first year of college. Her book, The Caliban and the Witch, I read in a course, and it really opened up a new way of thinking for me. And for that reason, I feel indebted to her work, even though I sometimes disagree with some of her thinking. I find her to be really inspiring. She's committed to a profound level of historical rigor, and paired with a lifelong commitment to political work that I find is often missing from theorists in academia. So this week we're reading from her book, Re-Enchanting the World, Feminism and the Politics of the Commons. And it was actually published in 2018, which wasn't that long ago. And she's 79 now. So she's been politically engaged most of her life, like since she was a student, and has had a lot of experience with actual like being involved in struggle. And so this book is actually a culmination of a lot of her observations from many of years of her work. And you can see that come through and see how it's like really a rigorous text that comes out of experience. So in the chapter we're reading for tonight, Commons Against Capitalism, Federici and her co-author, George Kafantzis, I believe is how you say it, explore what we actually mean when we say anti-capitalist commons and how we can prevent the commons from being co-opted by a capitalist agenda. They expose an inconsistency with kind of the ways in which the commons are co-opted by capitalism, and then propose a set of criteria that explicitly defines the commons and frames the commons as a necessary means of survival that is transformative to social relations. And that's really key for them, the element of the transformative to social relations. Because it's not, they're saying it's not necessarily like, oh, this class is the commons. It's rather a way of being and relating and existing with one another. And what this also means is that the commons do not continue to serve the project of capitalism. And if they do, they're not actually the commons. So yeah, the task at hand and what they're saying in the text is to ensure that commons are transformative to social relations, the way that we relate to each other, not just materiality, and acknowledge that the commons are a product of struggle and struggles of social conditions that are anti-capitalist in essence. So with that, I will pass it over to Kavi for the screen share. Thank you so much for screen sharing tonight, Kavi.
I'll start us off here. Comments Against and Beyond Capitalism with George Kafantzis. In our view, we cannot simply say no commons without community. We must also say no commons without economy, in the sense of oikonomia, i.e., the reproduction of human beings within the social and natural household. Hence, reinventing the commons is linked to the reinvention of the communal and commons-based economy. Maria Mize and Veronica Benthol Thompson, The Substance Perspective. Commons have become a ubiquitous presence in the political economy and even real estate language of our time. Left and right, neoliberals and non-Keynesians, conservatives and anarchists use the concept in their political interventions. The World Bank has embraced it, requiring in April 2012 that all research conducted in-house or supported by its grants be open access under copyright licensing from Creative Commons, a nonprofit organization whose copyright licenses are designed to accommodate the expanded access to information afforded by the internet. Even that titan of neoliberalism, The Economist, has proven to have a soft spot for it. In its praise of Elinor Ostrom, the denoy of common studies and critic of market totalitarianism, as indicated by the eulogy in its obituary, it seemed to Elinor Ostrom that the world contained a large body of common sense. People left to themselves would sort out rational ways of surviving and getting along. Although the world's arable lands, forests, freshwater, and fisheries were all finite, it was all possible. Were continent-wide, like the networks of commons in the pre-colonial America stretched from present-day Chile to Nicaragua to Texas. To share them without depleting them and care for them without fighting, while others wrote gloomingly of the tragedy of the commons, seeing only overfishing and overfarming in the free-for-all greed of Miss Ostrom, with her loud laugh and louder tops, with cut a cherry, and a contrarian figure. Finally, it is hard to ignore the prodigal way of common or commons in the real estate discourse of university campuses, shopping malls, and gated communities. Elite universities that cost students $50,000 a year call their libraries information commons. It is almost a law of contemporary society that the more commons are attacked, the more they're celebrated. In this essay, we examine the reasons for these developments and respond to some of the main questions facing anti-capitalist commoners today. What do we mean by anti-capitalist commons? How can we create a new mode of production no longer built on the exploitation of labor out of the commons that our struggles bring into existence? How can we prevent the commons from being co-opted and instead providing an alternate to capitalism, becoming platforms on which a sinking capitalist class can reconstruct its fortunes?
History, capitalism, and the commons. We start with a historical perspective on the commons, keeping in mind that history itself is a common, even when it reveals the ways in which we have been divided, provided it is narrated through a multiplicity of voices. History is our collective memory, our extended body connecting us to a vast expanse of struggles that give meaning and power to our political practice. History shows us that commoning is the principle by which human beings have organized their existence on this earth for thousands of years. As Peter Linebaugh has reminded us, there is hardly a society that does not have the commons at its heart. Even today, communal systems of property and commoning social relations continue to exist in many parts of the world, especially among the indigenous people of Latin America, Africa, and Asia. When we speak of commons, then, we do not only speak of one particular reality or a set of small-scale experiments like the rural communes of the 1960s in Northern California, however important they may have been. We speak of large-scale social formations that at times were continent-wide, like the networks of commons that in pre-colonial America stretched from present-day Chile to Nicaragua and Texas, connected by a vast array of exchanges, including gift and barter. In Africa as well, communal land tenure systems have survived to the present, even in the face of an unprecedented land-grabbing drive. In England, common land remained an important economic factor until the beginning of the 20th century. Linebaugh estimates that in 1688, 1/4 of the total area of England and Wales was common land. After more than 2 centuries of enclosures involving the privatization of millions of acres, according to the 11th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, the amount of common land remaining in 1911 was 1,500,000 to 2 million acres, roughly 5% of English territory. By the end of the 20th century, common land was still 3% of the total of the territory.
These considerations are important, not because we wish to model our concept of the commons and attending practices on the past. We will not construct an alternative society by nostalgic returns to social forms that have already proven unable to resist the attack of capitalist relations against them. The new commons will have to be a product of our struggle. Looking back through the ages serves, however, to rebut the assumption that the society of commons we propose is a utopia or a project that only small groups can realize, rather than the commons being a political frame for thinking of alternatives to capitalism. Not only have commons existed for thousands of years, but elements of a community-based society are still around us, though subject to a constant attack that recently has intensified. Capitalist development requires the destruction of communal properties and relations. With reference to the 16th and 17th century enclosures that expel the peasantry in Europe from the land, the active birth of modern capitalist society, Marx spoke of primitive accumulation. But we have learned that this was not a one-time affair, spatially and temporally circumscribed, but a centuries-long process that continues into the present. Primitive, or better, originary accumulation is the strategy the capitalist class always resorts to in times of crisis, since expropriating workers and expanding the labor available for exploitation are the most effective methods to reestablish the proper balance of power and gain the upper hand in the class struggle. In the era of neoliberalism and globalization, this strategy has been developed in the extreme and normalized, making primitive accumulation and the privatization of the Commonwealth a permanent process, now extending to every area and aspect of our existence. Not only are lands, forests, and fisheries appropriated for commercial uses in what appears to be a new land grab of unprecedented proportions, we now live in a world in which everything from the water we drink to our body cells and genomes has a price tag or is patented, and no effort is spared to ensure that companies have the right to enclose all the remaining open space on Earth and force us to pay to gain access to it. From New Delhi and New York to Lagos and Los Angeles, urban space is being privatized. Street vending or sitting on the sidewalks or stretching on a beach without paying are being forbidden. Rivers are dammed, forests logged, waters and aquifers bottled away and put on the market, and traditional knowledge systems are sacked through intellectual property regulations, and public schools are turned into for-profit enterprises. This is why the idea of the commons exercises such an attraction on our collective imaginations. Their loss expands our awareness of the significance of their existence and increases our desire to learn more about them.
Commons and the class struggle. For all the attacks on them, commons have not ceased to exist. As Massimo De Angelis has argued, there have always been commons outside of capitalism that have played a key role in the class struggle, feeding both the utopian/radical imagination and the bellies of many commoners. The mutual aid associations that workers had organized, which were later displaced by the welfare state, are key examples of this outside. More important for us is the fact that new commons are constantly created. From the free software movement to the solidarity economy movement, a whole world of new social relations is coming into existence based on the principle of communal sharing, sustained by the realization that capitalism has only more work in store for us, more wars, more misery, and divisions. Indeed, at a time of permanent crisis and constant assaults on our jobs, wages, and social spaces, the construction of commons is becoming a necessary means of survival. It is not a coincidence that in the last few years in Greece, as wages and pensions have been cut on average by 30%, and unemployment among youth has reached 50%, several forms of mutual aid have appeared, including free medical services, free distributions of produce by farmers in urban centers, and the repair by electricians of wires that were cut because the bills were not paid. We must stress, however, that the commoning initiatives we see proliferating around us, time banks, urban gardens, community-supported agriculture, food co-ops, local currencies, Creative Commons licenses, bartering practices, information sharing, are more than dikes against the neoliberal assault on our livelihood. They are experiments in self-provisioning and the seeds of an alternative mode of production in the making. This is also how we should view the squatters movement, the squatters movements that have formed in many urban peripheries throughout the world since the 1980s, products of land expropriations, but also signs of a growing population of city dwellers disconnected from the formal world economy, now organizing their reproduction outside of the state and market control. As Raoul Zebecki suggests, these urban land squats are better envisioned as a planet of commons, in which people exercise their right to the city rather than the planet of slums that Mike Davis has described. The resistance of indigenous peoples in the Americas to the increasing privatization of their lands has given the struggle for commons a new impulse. While the Zapatistas call for a new Mexican constitution, recognizing collective ownership, have gone unheeded. The right of indigenous people to use the natural resources in their territories was sanctioned by the new Venezuelan Constitution of 1999. In 2009, in Bolivia as well, a new constitution recognized communal property. We cite these examples not to propose that we rely on the state's legal apparatus to promote the society of commons that we call for, which would be a contradiction, but to stress how powerful is the demand coming from the grassroots for the creation of new forms of sociality and provisioning under communal control and organized on the principle of social cooperation.
Co-opted and gated commons. In the face of these developments, the task before us is to understand how we can connect these different realities, and above all, how we can ensure that the commons we create are truly transformative of our social relations. We have commons, in fact, that are co-opted by the state, others that are closed and gated commons, and still others that are commodity producing and ultimately controlled by the market. Consider two examples of co-opted commons. For years now, part of the capitalist international establishment, especially the World Bank, has been promoting a softer model of privatization that appeals to the principle of the commons. In the name of protecting the global commons, for example, the World Bank has expelled from forests people who had lived there for generations, while giving access to those who can pay, arguing that the market, in the form of a game park or an ecotourism zone, is the best instrument of conservation. The UN also advocates the right to manage access to the world resources, like the atmosphere, the oceans, or the Amazon forests, again, in the name of preserving the common heritage of humanity. Communalism is also the jargon under which volunteer labor is recruited by governments. For instance, former British Prime Minister Cameron's Big Society program proposed to mobilize people's energies for a variety of volunteer programs, presumably compensating for the cuts in social services introduced in the name of the economic crisis. In an ideological break with the tradition that Margaret Thatcher initiated in the 1980s when she proclaimed, "There is no such thing as society," proceeding to cut even the glass of milk out of the children's school lunch, the Big Society is now ensconced in a series of laws, including the Public Services Social Value Act. This legislation instructs government-sponsored organizations from daycare centers to libraries and clinics to recruit local artists and young people who, without pay, will engage in activities increasing the social value, defined as contribution to social cohesion and reduction of the cost of social reproduction. In other words, nonprofit organizations providing programs for the elderly will qualify for government funding if they can show they create social cohesion and social value, measured according to a special arithmetic factoring in the advantages of a socially and environmentally sustainable society embedded in a capitalist economy. In this way, communal efforts to build solidarity and cooperative forms of existence outside the control of the market are subsumed by a program intent on cheapening the cost of social production and contributing to accelerate the layoffs of paid public.
Another 5 minutes.
These are two examples of states, national and global, using the commons form to achieve their uncommon aims. But there is a wide spectrum of commons, ranging from closed residential communities through consumer co-ops to certain kinds of land trusts and housing co-ops, where people share access to common resource fairly and democratically, but are indifferent to or even hostile to the interests of outsiders. We call these commons gated commons and argue they are quite compatible capitalist relations. In fact, many operate as if they were corporations, with the commoners being something like shareholders. They constitute a fast-growing sector of the institutions that self-identify as commons.
Such commons are rooted in the recognition that in this neoliberal period, when the ideology of the market is triumphant, it's crucial for individuals to protect themselves against its, quote, failures and catastrophes. Commons can strengthen our collective power to intervene in markets. Thus, many gated communities feature common swimming pools, golf courses, libraries, woodworking shops, theaters, and computer rooms. Gated commoners share resources that would be difficult, expensive, or impossible for any individual to purchase and enjoy. But these resources are jealously guarded from the use of outsiders, especially those who would be unable to pay the often hefty fee for buying into the common. An example of gated commons are housing co-ops. There are more than 1 million housing units organized as co-ops in the US. Though a majority of them embrace commons principles for their shareholders, they are often legally obliged to attend to their monetary interests alone. Their cooperation remains on the instrumental plane and rarely takes on a transformative character. Together, these gated commons satisfy the basic needs for food, housing, and recreation of millions of people on a daily basis. This is power of collective action, but they do not construct different social relations and may even deepen racial and intra-class divisions.
Commodity producing commons. Along with gated commons, there are commons producing commodities for the market. A classic example are the unenclosed alpine meadows of Switzerland, which every summer become grazing fields for dairy cows, providing milk for the dairy industry. Assemblies of dairy farmers manage these meadows. Indeed, Garrett Hardin could not have written his Tragedy of the Commons had he studied how Swiss cheese came to his refrigerator. Another often cited example of commons producing for the market are the more than 1,000 lobster fishers of Maine, operating along hundreds of miles of coastal waters, where millions of lobsters live, breed, and die every year. Over more than a century, lobster fishers have built a communal system of sharing the lobster catch on the basis of agreed upon divisions of the coast into separate zones managed by local gangs and self-imposed limits on the number of lobsters to be caught. This has not always been a peaceful process. Mainers pride themselves on their rough individualism, and agreements between different gangs have occasionally broken down. Violence has then erupted in competitive struggles to expand the allotted fishing zones or to bust the limits on catch. But the fishers have quickly learned that such struggles destroy the lobster stock and in time have restored the commons regime. Even the Maine State Fishery Management Department now accepts this commons-based fishing, which was outlawed for decades as a violation of antitrust laws. One reason for this change in official attitude is the contrast between the state of the lobster fisheries compared to that of the ground fishing, i.e. fishing for cod, haddock, flounder, and similar species that is carried out in the Gulf of Maine and in Georges Bank, where the Gulf connects with the ocean. Whereas in the last quarter century, the former has reached sustainability and maintained it even during some severe economic downturns. Since the 1990s, one species after another of groundfish has been periodically overfished, leading to the official closure of Georges Bank for years at a time. At the heart of the matter are one, the difference in the technology used by ground fishing and lobster fishing, and above all, two, the difference in the site where the catches are taken. Lobster fishing has the advantage of having its common pool resource close to the coast and within the territorial waters of the state. This makes it possible to demarcate zones for the local lobster gangs, whereas the deep waters of Georges Bank are not easily amenable to a partition. The fact that Georges Bank is outside the 20-mile territorial limit also meant that outsiders using big trawlers were able to fish until 1977, when the territorial limits were extended to 200 miles. They could not have been kept out before 1977, contributing in a major way to the depletion of the fishery. Finally, the rather archaic technology lobster fishers uniformly employ discourages competition. By contrast, starting in the early 1990s, improvements in the technology of ground fishing, quote unquote, better nets and electronic equipment capable of detecting fish more, quote unquote, effectively, have created havoc in an industry that is organized on an open access principle. Get a boat and you will fish. The availability of a more advanced and cheaper detection and capture technology has clashed with the competitive organization of the industry that had been ruled by the motto, each against each and nature against all, ending in the tragedy of the commons Hardin envisioned in 1968. This contradiction is not unique to Maine ground fishing. It has plagued fisher communities across the world who now find themselves increasingly displaced by the industrialization of fishing and the hegemonic power of the great trawlers whose dragnets deplete the oceans. Fishers in Newfoundland have thus faced a similar situation to those of Georges Bank, with disastrous results for the livelihood of their communities. The lobster commons are an important alternative to the logic of competition. At the same time, they are embedded in the international seafood market and their fate is ultimately determined by it. If the market for lobster collapses or the state decides to allow for offshore oil drilling in the Gulf of Maine, the lobster commons will be dissolved, as they do not have any autonomy with respect to market relations.
Finding commons. Oh,
You can go ahead.
okay. The existence of gated and commodity producing commons demonstrates that there are many forms of commons and challenges us to see what aspects of commoning activities identify them as other from state and market, and the principle of a social organization alternative to capitalism. To this end, keeping in mind Massimo De Angelis's recommendation against setting up models of commons, we propose some criteria drawn from discussions with comrades and practices we have encountered in our political work. To contribute to the long-term construction of a new modes of production, commons should be autonomous spaces and should aim to overcome the divisions existing among us and build the skills necessary for self-government. Today, we see only fragments of the new society potentially in the making, in the same way as we can spot fragments of capitalism in urban centers like Florence in late medieval Europe, for example, where broad concentrations of workers already existed in the textile industry by the mid-14th century. 2, commons are defined by the existence of a shared property in the form of a shared natural or social wealth, lands, waters, forests, systems of knowledge, capacities for care, to be used by all commoners without any distinction, but which are not for sale. Equal access to the necessary means of reproduction must be the foundation of life in the commons. This is important because the existence of hierarchical relations makes commons vulnerable to enclosures.
3, commons are not things but social relations. This is the reason why some, for example, Peter Linebaugh, prefer to speak of commoning, a term that underscores not the material wealth shared, but the sharing itself and the solidarity bonds produced in the process. Commoning is a practice that appears inefficient to capitalist eyes. It is the willingness to spend much time in the work of cooperation, discussing, negotiating, and learning to deal with conflicts and disagreements. Yet only in this way can a community in which people understand their essential interdependence be built. 4, commons function on the basis of established regulations stipulating how the commonwealth is to be used and cared for, that is, what the commoners' entitlements and obligations should be. 5, commons require a community, the principle being, quote, no community, no commons, end quote. This is why we cannot speak of, quote, global commons, a concept that presumes the existence of a global collectivity. In the name of protecting the global commons and the common heritage of humanity, the World Bank launched a new privatization drive expelling from forests people who had lived there for generations. Indeed, the World Bank has taken on the role of representing the global collectivity because it is a part of the United Nations system set up in the post-World War II era to represent collective capitalism in all its varieties, including the statist versions of the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. The UN presents itself not as the voice of a collective capital that does exist, but as a stand-in for a collective humanity that does not exist. On this basis, it claims to manage access to common resources like the atmosphere and the oceans in lieu of the non-existent but coming humanity. Evidence of the fraud involved in the concept of the global commons was a debate that took place on June 14th, 2012, during the hearing at the US Senate Committee on Foreign Relations concerning the ratification of the Law of Sea, which is meant to codify the use of the oceans beyond the 200-mile economic exclusion zone claimed by most nations with oceanic coastlines. This hearing pitted former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld against Senators John Kerry and Richard Lugar. Rumsfeld was against the treaty because it required companies that mine the ocean commons, i.e. beyond the 200-mile limit, to contribute to a fund that would compensate less developed countries whose companies do not have the technological or capital requirements to do such mining. He claimed that this type of wealth redistribution is a, quote, novel principle that has, in my view, no clear limits, end quote, and that, quote, could become a precedent for the resources of outer space. Kerry and Lugar instead argued in favor of the ratification of the Law of the Sea Treaty, not to protect the seas from capitalist exploitation, but because they believe the treaty gave mining companies an unequivocal legal claim to the ocean floor. Quote, accession to the Law of the Sea Convention is the only means to protect and advance the claims of US entities to the vast mineral resources contained on the deep seabed floor, end quote, reads a June 13th letter to Mr. Kerry and Mr. Lugar from organizations including the American Petroleum Institute and the US Chamber of Commerce. The debate among the global commoners, Rumsfeld, Kerry, and Lugar, was over whether or not it was necessary to bribe capitalists who cannot scramble for the riches made available by the greatest spatial enclosure in history. This is what the principle of the common heritage of humanity came to on June 14th, 2012.
The Global Commons designation is a fraudulent maneuver that must be rejected. The same applies to the United Nations designation of selected cities and geographical areas as heritage of humanity, which required municipalities and government to adopt protection and valorization measures that benefit the tourist industry while diverting resources away from the works that would improve the conditions of local populations. Commons are constituted on the basis of social cooperation, relations of reciprocity and responsibility for the reproduction of shared wealth, natural or produced. Respect for the people and openness to heterogeneous experiences provide the rules of cooperation observed, distinguishes from gated communities that can be committed to racist, exclusionary practices while fostering solidarity among their members. Commons are shaped by collective decision making through assemblies and other forms of direct democracy. Grassroots power, power from the ground up, power derived from tested abilities, and continual rotation of leadership and authority through different subjects depending on the task to be performed, is the source of decision-making. This distinguishes commons from communism, which co-sign power to the state. Commoning is a reclaiming the power of making basic decisions about our lives and doing so collectively. This aspect of the commons is akin to the concept of Horizontal did that was coined during the revolt in Argentina that began on December 19th through the 20th, 2001, which has since become popular among social movements, especially in South America. It eschews the hierarchical structure of political parties, which decisions made by general assemblies instead of by predefined central committees, where issues are discussed with the goal of achieving a consensus. Commons are a perspective fostering a common interest in every aspect of life and political work, and are therefore committed to refusing labor hierarchies and inequalities in every struggle and prioritizing the development of a truly collective subject. All of these characteristics differentiate the common from the public, which is owned, managed, controlled, and regulated by and for state, constituting a particular type of private domain. This is not to say that we shouldn't fight to ensure that the public is not privatized. As an intermediate terrain is in our interest that commercial interests do not engulf the public, but would not lose sight of the distinction. We cannot abandon the state, since it is the site of accumulation of the wealth produced by our past and present labor. Similarly, most of us still depend on capital for our survival, as most of us do not have land or other means of substance. But we should work to ensure that we go beyond the state and capital. Conclusion, the notion of the commons is today the object of much debate and experimentation. There are many issues that are still unsolved, but it is clear that commoning will be a growing practice as neither state nor market can guarantee our reproduction. The challenge that we face in the context is not how to multiply commons initiatives, but how to place at their center of our organizing the collective reappropriation of wealth we have produced and abolition of social hierarchies and inequalities. Only by responding to these imperatives can we rebuild communities and ensure that the commons are not created at the expense of well-being of other people and do not rest on new forms of colonization.
Thank you, Tarina. That ends our reading for tonight. And before moving on to the discussion, wanted to do a kind of a deeper dive into talking a little bit about public lands in the United States. And as authors has differentiated between public and the commons and being separate. But in today, kind of talking a little bit more about the commodity producing commons, especially in public lands in the United States, as public lands are kind of have the myth of being owned by the public and fewer access and held by the state for the public's interest. Today, nearly 40% of the United States is public land, either owned by the Bureau of Land Management, United States Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, Department of Defense, National Park Service, states, or other federal agencies. The federal government owns roughly 640 million acres, or about 28% of the 2.27 billion acres of land in the United States. This goes back to the founding of the country, with stealing land and buying stolen land from other countries for the benefit of the ranchers, industry, and so-called nation building. And we're discussing this kind of commodity producing commons, so-called public lands. One particular incident comes to mind, especially when reading about the ranchers or cattle grazers in Switzerland, and that's the examples of the Bundy ranchers in southeastern Nevada and the anti-government movements that fuel the alt-right. And if you're not familiar, kind of a quick history of that was that the 2014 Cliven Bundy with his sons Ammon and Ryan Bundy led an armed militia on their family ranch near Bunkerville, Nevada, to stop the Bureau of Land Management from rounding up their cattle, which have been trespassing on public lands for 20 years. In order to collect the unpaid grazing permit fees, the Bureau of Land Management attempted to confiscate the rancher's cattle, and the federal agents were met with resistance of a lot of white guys and guns, essentially, and allowed the Bundys to continue their willful trespassing, which they still continue today, which is nothing less than an example of white privilege. And in 2016, they did again in Oregon to demand that all federal lands be returned to the rightful owners, which are white ranchers in their definition of the original owners of the land. What's more interesting is the Bureau of Land Management, which is the federal agency with the largest share of public lands, manages livestock grazing on 150 million acres with nearly 18,000 permits and leases by ranchers who graze cattle and sheep, collecting over $14.5 million in fees annually. And according to the BLM, in 2016, they made over $2 billion in royalty revenue from federal leases. And it's not just ranching, it's the federal government and state governments helps to commodify other commons for the profit of individuals and corporations. These are commercial fishing permits, oil and gas extraction permits, mining, logging, sale of land, water usage rights, and other ways that our public lands, oceans, and watersheds are being exploited to serve the needs of the capitalist interests with no money or consultation with the original stewards of the land. There are more than 63,000 oil well and gas wells on Bureau of Land Management public lands, and the ranchers are paying as little as $2 per acre, while the industry makes over $180 billion annually. Ranchers and grazing cattle pay as little as $1.35 AMU, which is a measurement of unit calculated as animal unit per month, which represents the amount of land is required to keep a particular animal alive for a single month. And until the 1960s, the federal government really didn't really administer their lands with very accountability to the broader public and to whom the public purportedly belonged to. But beginning in the Wilderness Act in 1964 and the National Environmental Policy Act of 1970, Congress empowered the public to weigh in on the planning and management actions. Eventually, public hearings became standard and required an opening, kind of a broader participation and different values to influence public land policy. Scientists began to question management systems that relied on predominantly economic considerations, and ecological data started to show that eliminating such predators as wolves or grizzlies, which is a tool in the federal toolkit to really open up public lands, turned into a cascading consequences throughout ecosystems. Fire suppression on land, national forests transformed open forests into tangled tinderboxes and threatened future landscapes. In 1970, Congress told federal land agencies to rely more on sciences in a new series of laws, like the Endangered Species Act of 1973 and the National Forest Management Act of 1976. Yet not much has changed. It still happens today. And under the Obama and Trump administrations, both opened up public lands for for oil and gas extraction at unprecedented levels. Currently, we have Native organizers who are demanding the federal government abolish the National Park Service and return the stolen land. While this may be difficult, Deb Haaland's Department of Interior has really opened up conversations with tribes about what that might look like, and hopefully we could see that within our lifetimes. And now we're thinking more about the commons of the earth, you know, with the billionaires racing off to space and space mining becoming a reality in the near future. What are going to be the laws that govern their conduct over the broader commons of the cosmos? Kind of left me thinking as well. So I'll stop there and pass it over to you, Izzy.
Thanks, Kavi. To answer that, that's why we shouldn't rely on the state laws, which is what the text was getting at a little bit, and that's why commons shouldn't necessarily just be material things, but social relations, because so often the commons are described as shared things or resources. And this text is exposing that these resource-based definitions of commons they're too limited. And it's important to emphasize that this text is, insisting an opening up of our understanding of the commons as more than just material resources. Of course, they involve a sharing of resources, but the commons are so much more than that. It's a way of relating to one another horizontally, and it's sustained by community. And another main takeaway from this text that I think is embedded in this point of social relations is almost the impossibility of defining the commons. And the authors give 9 criteria for the commons, which they state are drawn from discussions with comrades and political work, practices that they've encountered in their political work. And I've summarized the criteria in the glossary, but I'll read them off now and then put them in the chat so that we could talk about them. But 1, commons are autonomous spaces or relations that lead to a long-term transformation against capitalist modes of production. 2, commons are defined by the existence of horizontally shared wealth and property, which are in air quotes because truly in the commons, wealth and property become different things because capitalism falls away. But anyway, they don't have horizontal or hierarchical ownership. 3, commons are not things, but social relations, i.e. particular communal practices that are incompatible with capitalist modes of being. 4, commons necessitate established principles regarding the ways commonwealth will be used and cared for. 5, commons require a community. Therefore, global commons is an impossible idea that must be rejected as a capitalist attempt of co-opting the commons. 6, commons are constituted on the basis of social cooperation, relations of reciprocity, and responsibility for the reproduction of shared wealth, whether that be natural or produced. 7, commons are shaped through collective, horizontal, and direct decision-making. 8, commons foster common interests in every aspect of life and struggle, and therefore are committed to the refusal of hierarchy and inequality. And 9, commons are not the same as the public because the public is still managed by the state. Thus, the public is still a particular kind of private domain. So my questions for tonight are, how do we navigate this difficulty of defining the commons while remaining committed to conversations about the commons and reaching kind of horizontal shared understanding of what the commons are? And is that necessary? And if so, why? In regards to the definition that these authors provide, are there points you take issue with, or alternatively points that really stand out to you as essential? And lastly, what are your thoughts on the kinds of social relations that arise in the commons and that the commons necessitate? So I will open up the floor for discussion. I'll put the questions in the chat as well as those 9 summarized points that are also in the glossary that's in the chat.
Izzy, when you say us or we, are you speaking to, what you're asking us what we would do, but is that in a global context? Is that in a national context? Is that in a community context or individual?
Yeah, so I don't think of we as global because the fifth point about it must be community based, and so global is not something that's even attainable in the framework of the commons. I guess when I'm saying how do we navigate, I'm talking directly to all of us in this
in this group
all right now that are discussing the commons, and how like you or me or Caroline might think about these ideas differently or similarly. So I guess I'm addressing whoever feels called to answer or respond.
I also have a question.
Yes.
The question is the idea that the commons needs to exist in one place.
Mm-hmm.
It's likely to be a capitalist attempt to subvert the commons.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could sort of go deeper into that.
Well, that was coming up.
Like especially about site specificity. And how big is here when we're talking about
I think that the issue with global commons that these authors take, as well as Vandana Shiva, who we'll be reading next week, is that global commons was a phrase used by the World Bank, basically, to co-opt this notion of the commons. But I don't, they're like the World Bank, really. They're going to say that they're doing they're commoning. And I think also the idea that, like, and Hannah Arendt talks about this in her book on the human condition, where she talks about the move of the citizen, the community member that's in a localized space. And then with the creation of the telescope and with space travel, it places the individual like outside of their community in a way. And so it creates this sense of alienation and impossibility to connect with one another. And I think there is something to be said about also like imperialism and this desire for globalism that's often driven by imperialists, or even like space travel, these ideas of like, I think maybe that's what, I think it's connected to a lot of different things, but this issue with like globalism as a cosmopolitan, like, neoliberal attempt at unifying the world.
It's just kind of interesting to me that when she uses the title Reenchant the Commons, my mind goes to the idea of like reenchanting the floodplain, right? So, and what Newton Harrison likes to say is, well, it's easier to reenchant a floodplain where it used to be a floodplain because the context for it, like the deep interdependent network in a floodplain is going to be faster to readapt where it used to be than if you tried to put it somewhere else. So I was thinking about reenchanting the commons and this idea that there's a certain amount of deconstructing what we've built and allowing what will become to be informed by what was, if that makes any sense. That's sort of embedded in the whole kind of word reenchantment to me. So I just think the idea of reenchanting something involves having a past somewhere.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's also in the text, they talk about how commons is something that has existed in many places at many times. It's a way of being that is more natural, not to use a word like natural, but it's more inherent to existence. And so a reenchantment in the commons is a return, or to enchant, to call into being, to sing out. It's a re-singing almost of something that is integral to existence, and that is far more natural than capitalism. And I think that's why they're making so many moves to explain it as an anti-capitalist, something that is going against. But yeah, the question of space is, I think, an interesting one.
I want to riff off of what you're saying, this idea of like natural, like I guess reenchantment is like something that's more like, or like more clean or origin before it's been, I'm going to say poison, because like in a personal context, I've been thinking a lot about land. I live in Brooklyn and there's been a lot of construction where I live. I specifically live in Red Hook, if anyone wants to contextualize that. And I've been learning like, oh, I live across a brownfield. Like, oh, after Hurricane Sandy, there's just lead everywhere. And also bringing it home is my folks last year, has it been a year now, like the fires, and I'm from Los Angeles originally, and they live on the other side of the Angeles crest, and essentially their home should have burned down luckily it didn't. But now, like a week ago, I get a text from my mom and it's like Nextdoor app, like, hey guys, like check your well water, like it's 2 times the level of arsenic. And so like I've been really thinking about the commons as actually like our bodies, because like recognizing that our bodies are not separate of the land in which we occupy, and like also, you know, tying back into this idea of like it does have to be community based, because like what bearing does like my body have in somewhere in like, I don't know, Japan or whatever. Like my body is responding to like what's across the field where like they're doing construction and there's like particulates in the air, and like I know for a fact there was lead. And so like just how, and yeah, and I'm like it's emotional and it gets me upset, and I'm segueing into like a place of like, okay, like my body is threatened, my folks' bodies are threatened, and like that doesn't seem fair. And it's not about property owned by somebody and how that property is maintained. It's like, what about the property of my body and how it is protected and maintained? So this is just something I'm wrestling with. So I guess to respond to that, like to me, the commons is like the commonwealth and the health of our own bodies, which is, I think, a reflection of the lands, the local lands in which we occupy. If anyone wants to respond to that or has questions.
I guess I've been thinking a little bit along both of these last 2 points, and if the question of commons and like material place. And I think what sort of grounds it for me is something that Izzy, I think, super correctly noted as like one of the most important parts of the way that Federici and her co-author are defining the commons, which is as a set of social relations. So what I've sort of been thinking is that like site is more of a question of like strategy than it is something intrinsic to like any form of commoning necessarily. Like they do point to these like important historical examples of North America and South America and the UK, and but that if we are to take Federici's bargain that I think I take pretty seriously, that the commons actually is something born of struggle rather than of like nostalgia for a place and time, or even of like a site specific notion of what once was here. Like commoning as a practice actually like bends these notions of space and time a little bit, as it has to be something like between people and between human and non-human animals and whatever, all of that. So I don't know, it's an interesting thing to think through.
I'd like to add something very simple, that addressing the last question that Izzy posed. What are your thoughts on the kinds of social relations that arise in the commons and that the commons necessitate? Simply, I see that participation in the commons enhances and brings meaning to relationships and to life on a more intimate and personal, meaningful level. And I think the reason why we're having these conversations now is that perhaps we are reassessing what this all means in light of the great travesties of justice that we've experienced over, centuries. An example I think of I don't know if it's appropriate to call it the commons, but in the early 20th century in Harlem and in Chicago and in Black African American communities, they used to have rent parties where people came together to raise money for each other when they had to pay their rent. I don't know. Is that an example of commons? Can anybody say?
I think that that's, I think that that is an example of definitely solidarity. I think it would be really commoning if they were just living there fully for free, squatting and supporting each other in the squatting. But yeah, the way of being where it's like we take care of each other, we are relating to each other socially, where we're pulling resources for one another. And so yes, it is related in the resource sharing, of course, but it's also, you know, based in this kindness that you're explaining here, Maria, I think. And also to speak to what Jasper said, I put it in the chat, but because I was just thinking as you were speaking, Jasper, but yeah, struggle, if commons are born out of struggle, like Federici and her co-author are saying, struggle is of course like tied to material existence and to whether that be like a particular space or resources, etc. And so they're very tied to this like resource experience, but I agree, like it does bend these things because it's born out of struggle.
I think it's useful to pick up this question of commons by putting it into context against capitalism. Because as Lauren said, places, individual places, local places, places that people had connection to, that were rooted, they were rooted in where they lived, all of that had to be destroyed for capitalism to succeed. So all of a sudden, all of our lives are tied into these massive, invisible financial structures, these massive grids of technology and infrastructure and water systems that determine how we live. And those have all been, they're all part of the engine of capitalism. So our lives are attuned and are fueling capitalism. And what the text is saying is that there are just glimpses of commoning, but mostly our experiences of commoning are what Maria described, which is we're sort of functioning inside the puppetry of capitalism. We have little ways in which we reclaim our sort of social relations and common mutual support. And that's not the same as the true spirit of commoning. And I think that's really important to bear in mind, that capitalism has really destroyed places, and they've made us all part of this invisible grid of this really good word, fraudulent global commons, which is an absolute sham and a total veil of deception. And if you had any interaction with the sort of apparatchik class of the World Bank, of which Washington, D.C. is awash, you would know that by saying the global commons, all they were doing was trying to ensure that they had access to it. People like them had access to it. People like them could take a plane and fly to some exotic place and have access to it, and strip the local people from having access to it. So that's really important to keep in mind. But there are plenty of local examples. I mean, most of us, I think, here are in Southern California, and LA, for example, it made a conscious decision to reduce the number of public parks and use the parkways, which is the sidewalk strip outside your house, as the main public lands for park space. And those are supposed to be commons for everybody, but that you're supposed to contribute to. And the absolute neglect that you see in most of the city because of the economic deprivation of people is an example of how that just doesn't work. But as well, I wanted to point out what Kavi was saying earlier about the structures in which we have supposedly common land. Part of the struggle, I think, is not material, and it is definitely social, because there are inherited legacy practices that are rooted in specific attitudes about really the underlying attitude in the BLM is, how do we lease this land out to some commercial outfit? Because really the goal of it is we just hold it in trust. It's really for exploitation. There are just these inherited legacy mindsets that govern the way that commons are used. And so I think that if we are going to struggle, it's really, I think, would be the biggest bang for the buck would be to reach those institutions which are so entrenched in their procedures, in their budgets, in their in the academic programs that instruct people who work there, that they all work in the same way. And it's not for commons, but it's sort of managing the commons for private profit. So when we change that culture, or even begin to touch that culture, maybe we can start to have something akin to what the true commoning is that Sylvia was talking about.
Thank you, Ansu, for tying all those loose ends together and shedding wonderful light on the conversation, as you always do. I wish we could all keep discussing. I feel like this conversation has not ran its course at all, but unfortunately it is 7. So, and fortunately, because we get to listen to Emily's sound piece. So yeah, we're gonna go a little bit over tonight. Thank you for bearing with us. And Emily, I will pass it over to you from your vehicle. You're gonna have your amazing sound piece vehicle.
Thank you. Glad to be with you all.
Thank you, Emily. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Emily. Good night.
Good night.
See you next week.
Thank you and good night.
Thank you, everybody. Emily, that was wonderful.
Thank you. The sound of the lobsters, the sound of the ocean.
Quite.
Good night.
Beautiful.
Good
And
night.